Hey everybody, welcome to another study out of the Gospel of Mark. We're in chapter 14 today. We're going to finish chapter 14, and we're looking at the trial of Jesus. And actually, there are two trials going on. One is a religious trial. The other is a civil trial. So, if you're ready to go, let's look at verse 53. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Now, according to Mark, Jesus is brought directly to Caiaphas, although he's not mentioned by name. And the rest of the Sanhedrin is present. And they're probably on an upper room in the palace of Caiaphas in Jerusalem. This must have been a large room because the Sanhedrin numbered 70. Now, whether or not all 70 were present, we don't know. We do know there must have been enough present for a quorum to take place. Verse 54, Peter followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. Now, if you're like me, you're wondering, boy, we're going in a different direction all of a sudden. Instead of continuing to unpack the trial of Jesus, we've made a sharp turn to look at what Peter is doing right now. And that's because at the end of the chapter, Mark is going to tell us about Peter and in detail describe what he's doing and what's going on with him. So, I do want to point out right here something that I do think is significant. Peter followed Jesus. Yes, at a distance. And it was at a distance because he was afraid. But let's don't discount the fact that he followed. He just couldn't bring himself to completely desert Jesus. And you may be wondering about the fire. Spring nights in Jerusalem were cool, and that explains why there was a fire at that time. Let's look at verses 55 and 56. The chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Mark wants us to see just how rigged this trial against Jesus truly was. It's probably early Friday morning, and what's amazing is there's no problem getting witnesses to testify against Jesus. But these witnesses cannot agree with one another. If it weren't so tragic, it would almost be humorous. Obviously, the Sanhedrin had planned this out in advance, and they had rigged the trial, obviously. Now, it's the death penalty they're seeking. So the law said that in order to have the death penalty, you had to have two witnesses. But those two witnesses had to give consistent evidence. They had to agree with each other. The smallest inconsistency would nullify and discredit them. And obviously we can see why that was. You're talking about a person's life. So, again, a carefully planned trial by the Sanhedrin, rigged, these witnesses trumped up, but they can't even agree with themselves. Let's look at verses 57 through 59. Then some stood up and gave false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another, not made with hands. Yet, even then, their testimony did not agree. So, this original try and the inconsistency in the witnesses doesn't stop Caiaphas and the rest of the Sanhedrin for very long. First round of the trial doesn't work. It's on to the second round. And they have these people who bring this charge against Jesus that he said that he would destroy the man-made temple. He would destroy that temple in Jerusalem and then rebuild another not made with human hands. And he would do it in 3 days. Well, there's no statement like that in the Gospels. This is probably an allusion to John chapter 2 and verse 19, which Jesus would have made almost 2 years earlier. And on that occasion, he did not predict that he would destroy the temple. He was talking about his own body, the temple being his physical body, that it would be destroyed and it would be raised in 3 days. And perhaps some of these witnesses had heard Jesus say what Mark recorded in chapter 13 and verse 2, where he does predict the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. He doesn't say he's going to do it, but he does predict the destruction of the temple. And so maybe it was even a combination of both of those statements of Jesus, taken out of context, distorted, convoluted, that they used to formulate a charge against Jesus. But Mark tells us it didn't work because the testimony of these witnesses was inconsistent. So once again, they fail. Let's look at verses 60 and 61. It says, "Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?' But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?'" So you can tell the situation is becoming incredibly tense because the high priest, the Sanhedrin, it's not working the way they had planned it. They had rigged it to work. And so finally, the high priest himself rises up and he begins to question Jesus. Now, he asked, "Are you not going to answer these charges that have already been brought against you?" And these are the ones where the witnesses could not agree with themselves. Jesus remains silent. He doesn't say a word. And so the high priest then asked him a question. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And what this indicates is by now that the religious leaders either suspected or they knew that Jesus regarded himself as the Messiah. That's what drove that particular question. And this question proved to be a stroke of genius. Why? Because blasphemy was a capital crime. So, if it didn't work by trumping up and rigging charges against Jesus, they would use his own testimony to condemn him. So, verse 62, "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Jesus' statement, his answer, is straightforward, very simple. I am. I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God. If you've been in this study with us all along, you'll notice that this is in sharp contrast to how Jesus seemed to deliberately avoid calling himself or letting others call him the Messiah. And if you remember, there are probably two reasons why he was hesitant early on to proclaim himself the Son of God, the Messiah, and to allow others to do that. One reason is because he did not want to be associated with the popular view of the Messiah during that day, and that was a military leader who would lead the Jewish people against the oppressors, the Roman government. His kingdom was not like that. He did not want that association given to him. The other is he did not want any premature activity to thwart his ministry. And so he was very hesitant. He wanted things to be quiet. But now at his trial, with the hour very near for his death, he's proclaiming with his own lips, "Yes, I am the Messiah." All right, now let's look at verse 63 and 64. The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. The tearing of one's clothes was originally a sign of great grief. And if you've read the Bible very much, you know that that's true. It usually was identified ripping one's clothes with agony, grief. But in this case, it was a public display, a very intentional public display by the high priest to show that he had just heard blasphemy. Jesus had just said, I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God. And so he rips his clothes and he asks the others, what do they think? And they say, it's blasphemy, which meant, as we said earlier, the penalty of death. Look at verse 65. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. Spitting and hitting were traditional means of expressing rejection and repudiation. I mean, that is ugly. You can think of few things uglier than spitting upon somebody and striking them. And when they ask, who hit you, this might have been an attempt to mock Jesus' claim to be the Messiah, because there was a rabbinic interpretation of Isaiah chapter 11, verses 2 through 4, that stated the Messiah could judge by smell and did not need sight. And because they were well versed, remember, this is a religious trial. Religious leaders are leading this. They were well versed in the scripture. They very well may have been thinking about that passage as they ridiculed, mocked Jesus Christ. Look at verses 66 through 68. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. So here we are now, being connected to what Mark alluded to in verse 54, that quick turn to Peter. And Jesus is being mocked, spat upon, and beaten in an upstairs room of the palace of the high priest, while Peter is below in the courtyard, and he's waiting to see what will happen to Jesus. The fact that Peter is there, that he's that close, indicates that Peter loved Jesus and was concerned about him. I think that's important to remember that, because we're going to see Peter clearly denies Jesus, but at least he was nearby. That showed that he loved Jesus. So this servant girl recognized Peter as he stood in the light of the fire. And maybe she had seen Peter with Jesus in the temple a few days earlier. She could have remembered him. And her contempt, if you notice this in the text, for Jesus is revealed in the order of the words she used to speak about him. Look at it. That Nazarene, Jesus. She held Jesus in high contempt. Now, verses 69 through 72. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. Her words, "This fellow is one of them," seem to show that she recognized Peter as part of a group or a movement that had Jesus as its leader. Peter's second denial that he has anything to do with Jesus is not convincing. So the next time, it's not the servant girl, but it's the others who've been listening to the servant girl and the interchange with Peter, and no doubt have had their suspicions aroused by her. And they also, it's interesting, Mark says, detect Peter's Galilean accent. Now, what's important about that is Jesus was known to have come from Galilee. So again, there's this association with Peter and Jesus. And so those around, not the servant girl, accuse him. And so Peter is really in a bind now. And remember, he's obviously already afraid. And now he's even more afraid. And so what he does is he calls down curses on himself if he is lying. And he swore that he didn't know this man you're talking about. That's a key line. He now says, I don't know this man you're talking about. The first two times, Peter had denied being identified with Jesus, associated with Jesus. This last time, he just simply denies Jesus himself. Now, I want you to think about this. It hasn't been that long ago in the Gospel of Mark where Peter is around with the other disciples in front of Jesus, and he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And now he's telling a group, I don't know this man at all. I don't have any association with him. And of course, the third denial was followed by the second crowing of the rooster. And Jesus had predicted that Peter would disown him 3 times by the time the rooster had crowed twice. So think with me for just a moment as we close the importance, the relevance of Peter's denial for the church to which Mark writes. It seems to me it's pretty obvious. To a church under severe persecution, the pressure to deny Jesus, it provided a warning. If the denial of Jesus Christ was possible for an apostle, let alone one of the leaders like Peter of the apostles, then they must be constantly on guard not to deny Jesus. But the story also provides assurance, and that is, if anyone did fail Jesus under the pressure of persecution, there is always, and this is important, there's always a way open for repentance, forgiveness, for restoration. Always a way to come home. We'll continue our study tomorrow. Thank you for joining us.